Welcome, my name is Amanda Lewis. I'm very happy to host this co-organized event. We organized this event with the Institute on Policy and Civic Engagement and the Institute on Government and Public Affairs, alongside my colleagues Joe Horth and Benjamin Superfine and everybody else involved. I'm sure there were lots of folks. And today we're hosting a panel of experts to learn how to build relationships with journalists. This series of Policy 101 workshops is one that we have been doing with, most of the time, with IPSI and with IGPA for how many years, Joe? Norma, do you remember how many years? Before COVID, so that's a good reminder that it's been a long time. Yeah, and it rotated through different topics, and so if folks have suggestions or ideas of other, the main thrust has been that there are many ways that we could collectively be increasing the impact of our research, and a lot of those skill sets, like writing policy briefs or building relationships with journalists or writing public audiences, are not necessarily things that we're trained for in graduate school. So what we're trying to do is think about different kinds of workshops we can hold for faculty and emerging scholars that will help facilitate the expansion of folks' skills. I'm excited we have three amazing panelists here today. I'll introduce them and then I'll start the questions, and then we're just gonna have a conversation, and folks should not feel like they need to hold their questions till the end. We'll take questions along the way as they come up, including if they're just for clarification. And we have about 50 people in the room, but I think there's also another bunch of people online, so we can't see that. Yes, sort of. We have today Dakota Irby, a professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies, where he teaches and advises in the college's Urban Education Leadership Program. He researches equity-focused school leadership as a lever to improve Black children's academic and socio-emotional experiences and outcomes. We have Steve Schwinn, teaches constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, human rights, and a specially designed legal writing class on civil rights. Steve is founding editor-in-chief of the American Constitution Society Supreme Court Review and founding co-editor of the Constitutional Law Prof blog. He is a longtime member of the American Constitution Society Chicago Lawyers Chapter Board of Advisors, and regularly works with high school teachers and students on civics education, and speaks widely on issues related to constitutional law and public policy. His work as writings have appeared in a variety of law reviews and other specialized periodicals, popular press publications, and online publications. Sherry McGinnis-Gonzalez is Associate Vice Chancellor for University Communications, leading a team of media relations, communications, and public relations professionals who amplify and protect the university's reputation, reach, and visibility locally and nationally. She brings more than 20 years of experience managing communication strategy for major university initiatives, including UIC's COVID-19 response, the acquisition of the John Marshall Law School, now UIC Law, and the opening of the academic and residential complex and engineering innovation building. As the university's primary spokesperson, that's a big job. Sherry leads university-wide communication strategy, preparedness, and management for emergency and crisis events. We are recording today's event. We will also post it on our website within a few weeks. And we are going to have time for Q&A. Like I said, for our in-person audience, you can just raise your hand. And for folks online, please submit your questions to the Q&A feature on Zoom, and our trustee colleague here, Marnie, will read them out loud to us. We are, for those online, using Zoom's version of live transcription to caption the event. It continues to get better, but it is not perfect, so we apologize in advance for any mistakes in that. And now I think we will get started. And the first question, maybe we can start and go this way, and we'll fix it up, is what are some of the best ways to build relationships with journalists?
Well, of course, I have to start by making a plug for university communications.
Yes, please.
Marketing and communications.
Yeah.
I would say the best way is to reach out to university communications. Me and my colleagues are always interested in getting to know faculty and staff on campus who have expertise in particular areas, who are open to talking with the media, and it just helps us to build a reservoir of experts that we can go to and reach out to, because we're in constant communication with the media when they're working on stories. So that would be my first plug. We also have an experts guide for the media that we house on today.uic.edu. Everyone in that experts guide has shown interest, has contacted us, has agreed to do media interviews if they're contacted by reporters, and so it provides a way for media to come directly to the campus website and find folks that might be willing to talk about certain subjects or areas of expertise. And then last, I don't want to take everybody's time here, but I would also say that if you are contacted, sometimes just randomly, like you may have a research paper out, a reporter might find it and reach out to you directly. If you're hesitant, if you need support, if you need us to negotiate an interview, please reach out to us, because that's what we're here for, is to help support all of our faculty and staff on campus. So those are just a few ways. Definitely respond to a reporter, even if you're not the right person. You could just tell them, hey, I might not be appropriate for this, but please reach out to University Communications, and then we will find somebody else, hopefully, to fill that spot.
What do you mean by negotiate an interview?
So oftentimes what happens is we get very vague information sometimes when a reporter calls or reaches out, and they'll say, I'm doing a story about X, Y, and Z, and there might not be a lot of detail. And they might think that they want a certain expert, but in going back and forth and having our team actually like have more of a conversation, what are you really looking for? Is this a panel discussion like today? Is this a one-on-one interview? Is this focused specifically on the program at UIC, or are we just one of many in a story? There's all kinds of things that we can sort of glean to help negotiate who's the right person, how much time commitment this might take, whether or not somebody from our office might want to be there at the interview to help support the faculty. So there's just all kinds of ways that we can sort of determine and get more information about it before you dive right in.
Okay.
First, thanks for inviting me to be a part of
Yes,
the
that
panel.
too. Thank you.
So I actually started in about 2021 working with the PR team.
Oh, okay.
So
Off campus.
Off-campus, independent PR team that could help me really craft the public narrative about my research as well as about my identity as a scholar. So the name of the company is Coriolis Company. So I have a PR coach. And especially when I have a book come out, I actually move into a model where I'm meeting with my PR coach once per week for an hour. And I get support with everything from, they do the pitches for podcasts. I focus a lot on Black urban radio stations, print media. They basically do a lot of, press releases and that sort of thing to really get the word about my scholarship out. I would say that one of the things that is important about building relationships is, following up, being professional, being on time, having a media press kit, understanding what your talking points are. And a PR person is different than marketing, because the PR person is really going to help you craft how you want to actually present yourself. So one of my priorities when I started working with PR was to not narrow myself to only being an academic, but I wanted the people to know that I'm also a father, I'm a husband, I'm engaged in my community. And so I get media hits and requests from a number of different vantages, whether it's hosting a Juneteenth baseball, tournament in my neighborhood, to creating a traveling children's museum exhibition, which is something that I did and released in Milwaukee. So those things aren't directly connected to my scholarship, but they're related, because the PR team is important because they help you figure out what your message is across all the things that you do. So even if you go to my website, my things that I came up with is that a struggle is necessary, progress is possible, and equity is imperative. So across all of the things that I'm working on, every time I'm doing an interview or talking with a journalist, I'm hitting on one of those topics. All of those topics cut across my books, my advocacy work in community, my work with children, even my music, right? So all of these different endeavors that I'm engaged in, the first thing I think is important is journalists like clarity. And so I know, and we'll get to this in a moment, I know the things that I should say yes to, and I also know the things that I'll say no to based on what kind of I want my identity and what message I want to actually convey when I'm engaging with the media.
Can you give an example of like a yes and a no?
Well, so I'll give you a really good example. I don't do like punditry type stuff. Like I'm not really interested in like a back and forth argument with anybody. I like and prefer people to interview me for like long form media stories. The interviews that I do are not, gonna be like a quick one-off. It'll be something like a long form. Partly what I want to do is I want to be on the last 5 minutes of the news, not the first 5 minutes of the news. You know what I'm saying? So I'm picky about those kind of things. And so if I hear from a journalist, the first thing I do, and my PR team, they know who to pitch to me and who to say no to. So they actually filter a lot of it. But a lot of times I'll get direct inquiries, and my first thing is to go look and see what the people have actually produced. If I don't like what they produced, if it's questionable, I say no. It's pretty straightforward. And you can see what that looks like relatively quickly. Sometimes there's some, especially, podcasts, sometimes there's video on, video podcasts, whether your video's on or whether it's off. I would prefer off than on. I do both, but some of the on ones are kind of clickbaity, so I just pay attention to what people's track record of what they're producing, whether it's print media, whether it's radio, So for example, I've been on Tavis Smiley. I love Tavis Smiley. I want to go there. He asks really deep questions. Another thing that I think about is whether the person has engaged with my scholarship. You can tell relatively quickly whether they've taken the time to learn what I'm about. Being on a podcast or being on an interview with somebody who's read your book versus somebody who didn't read your research or your book are very different experiences. I don't say no to all of those, but I prioritize the ones that have demonstrated an interest in what I have to offer.
So first off, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's really wonderful to engage with you all about this important topic. And I'm sort of frantically taking notes as I'm listening to my two colleagues, because to call me an expert on this, I think is way overstated. I sort of stumbled into doing a lot of media almost by accident. Before we became part of the UIC community at the law school, I've been doing a lot of blogging in my discipline, constitutional law and public policy, and so was able to reach audiences through my blogging and get media requests based on my writings, and actually they came pretty easy and would call me directly. So I wasn't working through our media folks initially, and then developed these relationships kind of over time. And I'll reiterate some of the things that we've already heard just in terms of developing and maintaining those relationships, how important it is, but also add a couple of things. So one of the things that I really appreciate about my media contacts today is that they really operate two ways. And so they'll contact me if there's a story happening and they want my view on it, or I've read something that I've written and they want some collaboration, or I'll contact them and say, hey, this is coming down the pipe, you need to pay attention to it. If you want to do a story, I'm available, or I can refer you to somebody else, and make it kind of a two-way conversation. With particular reporters in different media, I've developed a good relationship over time, so that we can also ask about things like each other's families and what we're doing that weekend, and just kind of have personal conversations, which from my end, I'm not sure if this is a best practice for the media side, but from my end, it makes it a lot more personal kind of relationship. It makes the media interaction much easier for both of us, I think, and actually results in much better reporting on their end. Again, from my vantage point. Since we've joined UIC, I have connected more with the media team here, and you all have been amazing and outstanding in supporting the work that I've been doing with already existing sources and developing new sources, and helping me to cultivate and continue those relationships. So kudos to you all, because it really has been fabulous. I guess I would recommend to anybody who's looking to get into media and publicize your work through media, contact your personal
And just to build off of what you just said, there's nothing wrong with building those relationships. That's what we want, actually. And for many of us that have worked here for a while, and Brian on our team, who I know you work frequently with, we've been doing this for a really long time. So we have those relationships with reporters and producers and people, you know, throughout Chicagoland, because we've known them for so long. It's hard not to ask, you know, how's your family? How are your kids that are in college now? So we do the same thing, and it does help when you're, you know, potentially not in these situations, but when we're being contacted about other things that might not be so positive, it's good to have those relationships at that time too.
Yeah. If I can add, one of the things Dakota said really struck a chord with me. Know what you're able to comment on and what you're not able to comment on. That's important because you won't put yourself out there doing something that you don't know anything about. But it's important too because you build a lot of credibility, or at least I've found that I've been able to build credibility with my media sources by saying, you know, I know the story is coming, I'm not your person for it, but I can refer you to somebody. Like, that helps develop that relationship.
Can you get an example of like an ongoing relationship you've had with a journalist and like what that's translated into in terms of?
Yes, yeah, so I've got actually I've got a couple that kind of fall into this category in print media. One from Reuters, one from the Christian Science Monitor. I don't know why, but we've just developed a relationship. And they contact me, I contact them when a story is happening. They will oftentimes email me with a series of questions. Sometimes I'll just email back, sometimes I'll give them a phone call. If I know that a story is coming or a Supreme Court case is coming down or something like that, I'll give them a heads up on it, let them know what my initial reaction is. And we are just almost in constant communication in that way. Most of my work with them is on background, and that's fine. It's fine with me, and I think it's fine with them. I just want to get the message out. And so if I'm quoted or not, I don't really care as long as they're understanding what's going on and communicating that effectively to their audiences.
So Dakota, I was hoping to ask you to talk a little bit more. I mean, I think one of the things that often happens for faculty and graduate students as they're learning how to do this is having to rethink what counts as expertise. Because in our fields, we're trained to think of our expertise very narrowly, right? I'm an expert on this one little thing that 100 other people do, and that's all I can talk about. But to the extent that I've done some media training or other work, one of the things they always, and I'm interested in how you would phrase this too, one of the things that they've said is you should think about expertise as the things that you might teach about, as a kind of broader umbrella. But you also named kind of different set of hats that I think are really important. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought about that as you kind of figured out what your space would be?
Yeah, well, I think early on, my general personality is not to talk to people. Right? You kind of know me, right? I don't talk to people at work. You know what I'm saying? Unless I have to. But you know, so part of it was me trying to like kind of come out of my shell. So the backstory is that I had a book that I wrote in 2016 called Black Participatory Research, and it didn't get I thought it was a great book. By the way, we'll be doing a second edition of it.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
But
We'll have a press kit.
Yes, I'll have a press kit, but it didn't get promoted.
Yeah.
So I spent all this energy working on it, and it didn't get widely read like I thought it should. So once I started to engage a PR team after multiple kind of failed attempts, not even understanding the difference between PR and a book marketing campaign, but thinking about a PR campaign, I started to really understand my kind of like broader identity. And one of the places that I really enjoy doing a lot of work is in like the Black parenting space. You know, parents of Black children. I never would have imagined that that would be a spot that would work for me. And what I find is that it's expertise, but it's expertise from my lived experience, from raising my children, in particular from having my children in public schools, all of those kind of questions. Having my children in a public school that's like 95% Black and low income, despite, you know, Black people are like, really, like, what kind of decisions are you making to, you know, why are you sending them there?
Yeah.
And I can talk about it from not only my experience, but I can talk about the research basis for why it's important for me to put my children in a predominantly Black school in their formative years, as opposed to putting them in a different kind of environment, because I want to really foment their identity. And I can talk about that because I know the research. And I can say that the research says this. So I found an audience is like, people who are raising Black children. And I have these anxieties around what schools do you put them in? How do you support them? How do you interact with teachers? And so I found that a lot of the more most enjoyable and one of the more high demand areas is for me to blend my academic research and experience and expertise with my experience as a parent. And I think there's this way of relating. It adds another layer of relatability. So if I'm like Dr. Irby, who published a couple of books on Harvard Ed Press, that's one presentation. But the more relatable presentation is when I'm able to talk to on a Black Talk Radio or on a podcast or write for Education Week about what it means to be a Black parent who understands how difficult it is to have Black children in a school district where you aren't, sure that their needs are going to be met.
Yeah.
And so there's that kind of like relatability piece. And so I had to begin to eventually identify myself as kind of like a person who has some like a parent, but a parent who has an additional set of information that allows me to parent differently than someone who doesn't have the research background. And so that's an audience that I communicate with a lot. And if I wouldn't have had the opportunity to think about those kind of issues with the PR coach, I would be probably talking to like education leaders primarily, as opposed to education leaders and parents and caretakers of children of Black children who are in public schools.
Yeah, and I'm about to come to you next about this expertise question, but I want to ask one more thing, because I think these conversations are most useful the more real we get. So I want to ask you, like, is it that working with the coach made you feel comfortable doing this, or does working with the coach make it okay to keep doing it even though it's so uncomfortable?
I've gotten much more comfortable over time.
Okay,
right?
I'm just curious.
One of the things is that, confidence builds through experience.
Right.
Right. And so I didn't have a lot of experiences. Some of the experiences that I did have were some of my earlier experiences, which I don't like these, were in studio.
Yeah.
High pressure in studio interviews. So whether, especially like, what is it, WTTW, like to go, go there. That's a very high pressure media environment.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the experience, I would say like, really prepare.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But also like talk radio is high pressure too. Like they're like, get your point across now. Right? And so, and we're getting ready to go to commercial and then they just cut you off. So I think that like the more I started to actually do it and I got the coaching, and again, the important part was like understanding what my talking points are.
Yeah.
And being able to shift the conversation, even if they ask me a question, I'm here to actually help y'all understand the content of my new book. So you're asking me about this piece, and I'll say, yes, Chicago Public Schools this. It reminds me of what I write about in chapter such and such. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So being able to kind of make those pivots, it's just really kind of like a practice. And so I feel more confident about it now because it's something that can be learned. And I feel like I get better and better at it the more I do it, and I've got better. And I've started to get the different mediums that I feel most confident and comfortable working in. That's important. It doesn't mean that I won't do something. I did a piece around like the Black Student Success Plan. And, that required quite a bit of preparation because I knew I was going to be on air. I need to have my talking points almost memorized. You know what I'm saying? And it's just a very fast pace and requires a different level of preparation than, a podcast where the person's read the book, they send me the questions in advance, and we're going to have a conversation.
So how do you talk to people about thinking about this question of expertise?
So everything that you just said is like spot on, and everything that I would, just emphasize to people that are being approached about doing interviews. With the addition of, I would say the storytelling piece of it that you gave is like so crucial. Even if you don't have that extra, you have the benefit of doing interviews in different areas because you've sort of explored that on your own. But let's just say you're still focusing on talking about your research and your academic experience. I think you can still tell a story in a way that is appealing to a reporter and actually work out those talking points in advance that really give anecdotes, that give data, that make it, that show what the impact of that research is, that's not as academic, but really more focused on this is how this work is helping the community. This is how we're taking this to the next level. And so I just think you can do all of those things, even if you don't have those extra pieces to telling the story that you do, which is fabulous. So that's one thing. But then expertise also, I would say, it's the thing you have to think about is that a reporter often, especially if it's not a long form story, if this is an expert because something is breaking in the news that day, you are far more experienced at talking about that subject, even if you don't think you are, because they are going to only want 30 seconds to a minute. It's going to be very quick. It's not going to be a deep dive. And anything that you say is going to be you're going to have far more expertise than other folks that they might go to. So I would just say, don't count yourselves out. Please don't, narrow your focus, because I think that your explanation earlier about what would you teach is really appropriate, because it's really more at a broad level when you're talking for those daily interviews, those requests for TTW on the panel, or a Tribune reporter who's doing something more broad and just needs, a quote or two, which Steve is great at doing constantly for us, I feel like. So I think that, it's great to have those sort of narrowed areas of experience that you have, but don't narrow it too much.
Got it. So Steve, can I follow up with you a little bit? You talked about on the record versus off the record.
On background,
On background.
which is different.
Okay,
Right?
yeah. So can you talk about those different layers and when you decide, like, is that something you negotiate with the person ahead of time, or what is the?
Sometimes. So when you're obviously when you're doing live stuff,
Yeah.
radio, TV,
Yeah.
that's
You're on record. Yeah.
say on the
Yeah.
record.
Yeah.
But for print media, if you want to speak and give information, but you don't want to be quoted, the magic language that you use is on background, not off the record, but on background. So I'm willing to speak to you on background, don't quote me, and just be clear about that up front. And when I've got relationships with print reporters that I'm able to do that pretty comfortably, and indeed they'll often ask me, can I quote you here, or do you prefer to go on background? I can tell them which I prefer. And what I find is that reporters will appreciate it, because Sherry, what you said is just so spot on. The expertise that you all bring to this is so far beyond what anybody else does in your field. And to be able to communicate that in a distilled way to a reporter is like magic to them. It's just incomparable for them to have you as a resource. So don't hesitate for a minute to hold yourself out as an expert in that regard. But on the other hand, if you don't want to talk on the record, you can say, I want to go on background. That's okay, you can do it.
I would also just add to that, you should always assume that you're on the record. I mean, there is no conversation that you should have with a reporter where you don't assume that you're actually on the record, unless you do set clear parameters, unless you know the person and have worked with them and have a reputation, a relationship, and they have a reputation for working well with you and your colleagues. It's always just safe to assume that you're going to be quoted, unless there's some other situation that you've worked out ahead of time.
With print media, they should ask you in advance if they can record the conversation. So there are a couple of telltale signs that I've discovered, and you two may have better ideas about this, but that I've sort of discovered over time with print reporters that sort of distinguish between good reporters and not so good reporters. One of them is that they'll ask if they can record in advance. Another is they'll ask you for your name and to spell it, and your preferred title, and your institutional affiliation, which surprisingly they don't often do, and then they often find out. One of the things that a couple of print reporters do all the time themselves, they'll get to the end of the interview, it's a pretty comprehensive interview, nevertheless, they'll say, is there anything else I should have asked? Or is there anything else you want to say? Or is there any piece of this that I'm missing, right? And just kind of open the door to a further conversation. And invariably that leads to another 10 or 15 minutes of a conversation. And I guess I just mentioned those because in my experience, those really distinguish the more thoughtful reporters from the less thoughtful ones.
Absolutely.
I think it reminding me, like, I sometimes, because of the role I'm in, reporters want to talk to me and I'll get on and I'll talk to them. But somebody once wanted to ask me about something about school closings and the class size, something that was a little, but I said, I'm happy to talk to you in background. And we ended up having an hour-long conversation where I told her how I would approach thinking about the story and then I told her some other people that she should talk to. And I just said, here are the things that we know about schools generally that might be really important for thinking about what's at play here, but so I didn't show up in the story at all, but then she talked to some really interesting people, and I thought, so that was in some ways much more edifying than the times when I've been, where, like, I know I said a long sentence and about a third of it appears in a quote, and you're like, that is not what I said. I mean, those were words that I strung together, but it didn't happen in that order.
Well, can I just mention
Yeah,
one point?
please,
Because I
yeah.
think this is like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Number one, they're listening to what you're saying, so
Yeah.
I assume that's all on the record.
Yeah.
And then you also don't have control over how they report it. And sometimes I'll look at stuff, I'm just like, that's not what I meant. You know what I mean? But they have a certain number, and then sometimes you might spend 30 minutes talking with somebody and you get one line. So I think that's part of part of the process of getting comfortable with that. What they hear, and a lot of times how they interpret it, and then the context that it's reported in, but then how they're writing the story, isn't always how I would have reported it.
100%. And that happens, and that can happen. That's happened to me in print media, but also in podcasts that are edited.
Yeah.
And it'll come out, like what you said, like I know I said those words, but that is not what I said, right? And I actually there have been a couple of times where I've actually called up reporters afterwards, or podcaster afterwards, and just said, all due respect, great story, but you didn't capture what I was trying to convey, and I'm not sure where the communication breakdown was when you need to know that. And they usually receive that message pretty well.
And I think that even with podcasts, like some of the things that I'll ask is video on, video off. Sometimes they'll have video off, but they'll use small clips to promote, right? So all those things are important in terms of how you present, what your background looks like. Y'all see this color shirt I have on. I've always been coached to wear colors that I typically wouldn't wear, even when I'm kind of because they'll record and it's a video, but then they'll only use the audio, or they might use the video for promotional purposes. One time, this is funny story, I had my whole liquor cabinet in the back of everything. They was like, it's not going to...
This is before you had the coach.
This was when I had the coach. She was like, what's going on? I had the whole stash back here, we talking. And I didn't know they were going to use the clips for promotional purposes. So they had certain clips. So I think partly just asking the questions so is it going to be, how heavily do they edit? There's some podcasts that just I pretty much put it out as is. There's others that will do heavy editing. So asking all of those questions so you know in advance, that really is an important kind of step in the process of engaging with different journalists.
Yeah. I once did a radio thing downtown here, and it was radio. So it was at 6 a.m. on a morning, So I just went down there, and it didn't occur to me that there would be they would want to take pictures after it was over to use her, and I was just like, yeah, I was like, okay, live and learn. So I'd love to hear all of you talk about this a little bit, but I'm going to lean on you here about setting boundaries with journalists. That's part of what we're talking about, negotiating, and maybe if you could also talk about when we've had these discussions before, discussions where we had journalists here instead of faculty talking, and they're often talking about the parameters that they're dealing with, and all the constraints on them that they're struggling with, that sometimes are helpful to think about, because then it helps you understand how you end up with what you end up with at the end. So.
Yeah, I mean, it varies so much. It's so broad. I would say, in general, just know that I guess the most important thing is time constraints, right? I mean, that is the number one thing that you're going to be faced with when you're contacted by a reporter or even anyone from our office. People often assume, why are they being so pushy? Why are they, reaching out to me several times within the same day? It's mostly because the reporters are on deadline. And so we're trying to meet deadlines. They're trying to meet deadlines. I think that, you have to have, if you're going to do this work and get the information out about your research, you have to sort of expect the things that have been mentioned already. Sometimes you don't have control. Most of the time, you don't have control over how the story ends up. But is it also, in your mind, worth getting that mention about your research, about maybe, you're expecting to need more funding down the road? So is it really something that you should consider because, the good outweighs potentially not having control over the entire piece? I do think that it's one of the things that anybody who does this work struggles with, because the reporters they are truly interested many times in the work that we're doing, that all of you are doing, but they just don't have the time constraints to actually tell that full story. So, we need to sort of work within what we have and know and have expectations that it's not going to be perhaps 100% about your particular paper or your particular work, but it's going to offer different viewpoints as well. I think just knowing that going in helps with expectations for everyone, so we can try to manage those and set, somewhat of a boundary when you're going into those interviews, but oftentimes, things change too in the editing process. So there's always that. A reporter may have one idea for their story, and then their editor takes it in a different direction. Things get edited completely differently than what they had hoped. So there's just all kinds of scenarios where that might change.
Can the two of you talk a little bit about the different, I don't want to say motivations, but like, what are the things, I mean, you gave a great example of your first book just not getting the attention you got, but what are the other things that, like, because you have to be committed to doing this. I mean, if you're going to do it, you got to put some time into it, you got to really respond, you got to reallocate your day sometimes. So if both of you could talk a little bit about what your motivations were for doing it and how you think it's helped either your work, or your visibility, or the world.
Well, yeah, I kind of told my initial story. I think there was a time when it worked for me. I get a lot of like earlier career scholars who asked me about engagement with media, and I honestly feel like early in my career, I don't know that it would have been the best use of time.
Yeah.
I think I got to a point where I felt like I had a certain level of like command of a particular topic, and that is kind of, I would hear other people, giving interviews and talking, and I would just be like, they missed this nuance.
Yeah.
They missed this part. And I think that's what was one of the things that motivated me, in addition to just wanting my scholarship to have a bigger impact. A lot of the early writing I did, like for education, like Education Week, I have the kind of relationships now where I can reach out to Education Week and pitch a story, and they'll say, sure. Because there's certain things like meet your deadlines. Some of the early pieces that I wrote, for example, the American School Board Association, they have a magazine. I wrote a piece there, and that was humbling because, I wrote it in a particular way, and they needed it to look very different for their audience. It was a lot of back and forth, but it was really useful because it allowed me to understand, how do I translate what's in this academic book to superintendents so they understand how to support the equity leaders in their district, right? And some of it is kind of like, you're writing it as like, here's 3 takeaways, A, B, C, and it's like, you don't have time to do like all the theory and, literature review. It's just like, here's the 3 things you need to know. So I think some of it was just really wanting my scholarship as I got to a certain point in my career to just actually start to impact practitioners. And that was a huge motivator for me.
Yeah, same. And so I do constitutional law and public policy over the law school as my day job and feel passionate about civics education and the idea of communicating, especially in today's times, kind of what's going on and giving people a framework for thinking about it. And to go to what you said, like listening to other commentators and thinking, that's not quite right? Like that really resonates. And so I just thought maybe I'll give this a whirl, right? And start to communicate in my own way. And it worked. And so
I think also figuring out, both of you have talked about like what your lane is, which I think is really important. Like there are folks who like really do a lot of social media. They're constantly engaged in trying to shape those conversations, but those folks, you gotta be on there on a daily basis. You're really gonna do that. But I'd love to hear you all talk a little bit about how do you prepare for on-camera interviews versus print versus radio, and like the different ways you think about that work.
I'll start, sure. So I think no matter what interview you're doing, whether it's for broadcast, print, online, radio, you need to start by actually really just bullet pointing out what your top 3 to 4 key messages are. Thinking about that in advance, writing it down if you have to. Practicing it is another thing. I know it seems probably a little over the top to actually verbalize it and practice it, but it really truly helps. I would also say try to be as concise as possible, because you know whether it's broadcast or print, it's going to be condensed. So if you can explain something in 1 or 2 sentences versus 10, it's going to be much more likely that it's going to be used. I would also add that I think one of the things that people may not think about when they're going into interviews is that once you've got your 3 to 4 messages, repeat, 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 try to come back, try to tie your comments back. Even if the question is not related specifically, you can use bridges to tie it back to what you want them to hear. And then I also would just add that when you're doing, particularly I would say for TV, there are some things that you can do to sort of help navigate that interview so that it goes smoothly, and have it be so that the focus of your interview is really on what you want them to hear. So when I say that, I mean, they ask the question, you answer the question with your messages, and then you stop. We always call it, don't feed the microphone. You don't need to keep talking for an extra 5 or 10 minutes. Because ultimately that's going to be something they're going to use. You want to just stick to your messages and try to focus on what you really want them to hear, as opposed to getting into, a broader conversation that might go down a rabbit hole. I'll stop there. There's a lot more we could say about that, but I'm sure my colleagues will cover some of it.
Yeah, I prepare differently depending on, what I know it's going to be. I love regular old school phone interview. That's my favorite thing to do, where they ask you, can I record? And then you're just on the phone. That's the most comfortable for me. But I've done the things like, get the lights. I'm a black person, so I don't show up good on computers unless I got the right lighting. So I make sure that the lighting is right. My partner, she bought me all those kind of things, because I used to be trying to figure out light. I have a couple of different places where I have backgrounds.
Not the liquor cabinet.
Not the liquor cabinet. But yeah, so I have my little kind of like, backgrounds and places where I set up, and it's almost just like setting up. And then I think one of the things that, so I think I didn't think about that stuff before I started doing it on a regular basis. And I mean, it's huge, because things go a certain way if I'm in an environment where I know things are going to work well. So if I'm at home and I think it's going to work well, and then somebody just happens to start getting some work done in the house, like right next door, it's like, oh, like, is this sound going to spill over?
Yeah.
I think there's things like having high quality microphone.
Yeah.
Some places want you to use ear pods. Some of them want you to connect in, making sure you have a strong internet connection. Like there's all of these small things that will take off the load. If you get those and you work all those things that you can control out in advance, it allows you to fully be present in the actual moment when you're doing whatever the interview is. That's the same thing if you're going to a location to do an interview, whether it's radio, like just go early. You know what I mean? Like don't rush, because you have to figure out parking. So I think there's a lot of things that I learned is like taking care of everything I can control in advance allows me to really show up and be present and have those talking points and thinking about what I want to say, as opposed to kind of it feeling hectic when I do show up, right? And just having kind of like the presence of mind and that sort of thing. And then that includes like what I wear. I have a pretty bland wardrobe. But one of the things that, I learned is that, and this is based off of research. They're just like, for men in particular, don't wear gray, don't wear navy blue, XYZ, wear something that's bright. It increases the likelihood that you get invited back. So I do that. We had the Spark Talks, and my PR coach told me, take your book, and when you talk about your book, hold your book up for 15 seconds. And I also wore my brand colors that were yellow. And she told me to do all this stuff. I'm like, this is ridiculous. So I do it, and then I end up on the front page of the UIC Today. You know what I'm saying? Like, with the book held up. Nobody else brought a prop. Nobody else brought a prop. So she was like, don't tell them you have a book. Show them. So I'm mentioning all this because all of that is advanced preparation. I had to make sure I had the book. And I had to take it up there. I had my speech, but at the
right moment.
And then, and I had, thinking of practice, I practiced it with her. And I like held the book up. She was like, you didn't leave it up long enough. You know what I'm saying? And she was like, give them a shot.
Right.
So I hold it up, and as I'm talking, I'm giving my remarks, but my hand is like this. She's like, don't put it down here, hold it up. So I did that, and then I land out of all the Spark Talks is like the one that like looks like the face of the Spark Talks. So I'm just saying all of that stuff is preparation.
And just to piggyback off of what you said, because there are a couple things I just wanted to comment on. Absolutely, how you look and the clothing is very important. And if you're doing interviews on TV, whether it's a setup that you might know you're walking into or not, there are certain things, like you said, that you just don't, it's not advisable that you wear. White, green, you might be like behind a green screen, you definitely don't want to wear green. There's little things like that will become more familiar as you start to do these, but that's another reason why I talked about leaning into using us and our team to help really assist and find out all that information for you so that you don't have to think about or ask, because if you're not used to asking about it, you might not know what those questions are. Secondly, and now I'm gonna lose my train of thought, there was something else you said. I think that in addition to, now I remember, what you're actually going to be, sort of looking like on camera, you also have to be aware of if you're in a panel situation, if you're not the only person being interviewed, what your facial expressions are when you're listening to someone else, because that can also be very uncomfortable, let's just say, if the camera pans to you and you're listening to a colleague and have kind of an interesting look on your face. So there's just all of those things that the more you do it, you get to become more familiar with, but little things make a big difference.
So I second all of that stuff, and I didn't know about the colors, so I'm taking notes. I appreciate that, because I'm always in gray or blue right now.
I used to be.
Don't do that anymore. What I try to do in addition to all these things, and practice, like put yourself before the camera, put yourself before the microphone, talk about the stuff constantly until your friends and family tell you to shut up, and just get used to the cadence of the conversation that you're going to have, whether it's live or in print. What I try to do to take a little pressure off myself in terms of the preparation is play some games with myself. So for example, if I'm doing a Zoom interview at home, I take down all the family pictures in my background, which trust is sooner practice. But I make sure that my dog picture is in the frame, right? And just because, or I'll have a bet with my kids that on a particular interview, if I'm in studio, that I'll use a particular phrase, right? That I'll work it in somehow. Just to kind of lighten my own feeling and take the pressure off a little bit. With all the preparation, sometimes you'll be in a situation that you simply couldn't be prepared for. So I remember when the day that the Obamacare decision came down from the Supreme Court, WGN asked me to be in studio, TV asked me to be in studio with Larry and I'm forgetting the woman's name, that's Robin and Larry. And I had never seen them before, so I didn't know their shtick, but my wife had watched them all the time. And so she didn't warn me, you know, that they're kind of fun. So I'm in there thinking, we're all serious, talking about Obamacare. And the decision came down while we were on air. And I don't know if you remember this, but there was all kinds of conflicting reporting about what the decision actually said. It ran over 100 pages, so here I am flipping through on my computer trying to figure out what does this actually say while we're in studio, live on air, with two people that had this shtick that I was utterly unprepared for. And the whole, I mean, it went wonderfully, thank goodness, but I attribute that to them, not to me. But how do you prepare for that? You don't. I think that you kind of do the best you can do. Just think about the stuff, talk about it as much as you can, and sort of mentally get yourself in the stage of talking in a live situation. If that's going to be an environment or two.
I'm going to go to questions in a second, so folks should get ready, but I just want to emphasize what you're all saying about preparation. As you're all talking, I'm having more of the what not to do stories that I remember in my own head, but one of them was about cadence, because I had a book come out, and I had done a bunch of long form interviews on radio where, you have an hour and it's often a call-in show, and I got used to doing those, and they're kind of fun because the person hangs up and then you can say whatever you want. Like, you can really answer the question or talk about how interesting the question was, whatever. And then I went downtown to do one of these 7-minute news talk radio things, and I thought 7 minutes, but it was 4 1.5-minute segment, and it was just such a, I got cut off so many times. I'd be in the middle of telling some anecdote, and they'd be like, and we're going to commercial. And I was like, okay, clearly I need to prepare more for this kind of thing, because it's not my genre yet. So that was always fun. So one quick question is how do you prepare for media stuff quickly? And I don't know, you've talked about all the wonderful things in your office. How much help can you guys provide for some of these things? Do people practice with you, or
sometimes?
Yeah,
it really depends on the person's comfort level and how involved they'd like us to be. But certainly we're available to do that.
Yeah.
I think, preparing quickly is really something that you just have to master over time, because these opportunities come up and they're fleeting. And so you have to, just dive into it and say, I'm going to spend 30 minutes of my day today preparing for this, and know that. Or you're just going to say, you know what, today's not the best day for me. Reach out to me next time. I might have, more time to prepare. But I think no matter what the interview is, you could even prepare now. So if you know that you want to talk about X, Y, and Z, and you want to get your 3 to 4 messages out, I know it's not ideal, but you know that you've got a paper coming out, or you know that there's something coming up that's maybe going to be breaking news. You don't necessarily have to do it the day of. If you can think about it a little bit ahead of time and give yourself some time and a breather to prepare, that might be the best way. I think, in those scenarios where it is just, let's, say we're going to tackle this today, if you do need somebody to sort of bounce those responses off, our team is more than happy to sit with you on the phone or on Zoom or whatever it might be, or in person, to practice. The other thing that I like to tell people, and this came from a former colleague who used to work for Voice of America for many, many years, he would always tell people, when you practice, pretend like you're at a cocktail party talking to your neighbor who knows nothing about what you do for a living or what your research is about. And how can you explain it to them or explain it to your parents or your grandparents in a way that really makes sense to a lay audience? So that's another way to just think about your preparation.
Do you have any advice about last minute preparation? Either of you?
So, just to kind of reiterate, you are so far more expert on this than anybody else that the reporter can talk to. And so speaking off the cuff on an issue that a reporter might contact you on that's within your portfolio is going to be a gold mine for them. No matter how comfortable you feel about it, it's going to be wonderful for them. That said, really don't be afraid to say no. If it doesn't work for you, or if you feel like you're just not prepared to talk about the issue that they've asked you to talk about, they're much more likely to call you back the next time if you say, you know what, I can't do this today, I'm just not ready for it. And if you stumble into an interview or through it, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I was going to say, don't be afraid to say no. I mean, I think at the top of the conversation, I mentioned how I have a preference. Sometimes I would get these like requests for such and such doing a story, and it's interesting because sometimes they only want you to write your responses out. That comes sometimes. Like there'll be these people who will be doing like a national study, and they'll filter through a PR team, through my PR team, and they'll say there are these people who want a couple of sentences of commentary on these things, and you can just kind of like bullet point it out, and you can end up in a story that way too. There's never actually even a call. This story happened this morning, and I need to get something done by like noon or 5 o'clock, and I might put you in the noon or 5 o'clock if you can respond with 3 bullet points to this. So that's something that happens too. I actually don't like that level of pressure. Again, thinking about like what messages I want to convey, I would agree that like I kind of know what I want to get across. And I kind of think about it as if I see an opportunity or inquiry come in, I'm thinking about like, is this an opportunity in the context of this story or these questions for me to convey the core message of what I'm committed to share with the broader audience? So it's not like I'm only going in answering only their questions. I think of it as I'm going in to share what I want people to know. And I'm going to use the context of their questions to share what it is that I want people to know, which means that, I'm not always in the cycle. Like I was kind of heavy in the cycle around like the rollback of the DEI pieces, right? Especially in public schools. That was a very active time, but I'm less likely to respond to things and say yes to things that like kind of come up that are like not squarely within my wheelhouse, or they put a lot of like pressure on me that I just don't want. You know what I mean? Like I could talk about this, but not by 12 o'clock. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I'll pass.
I have more questions, but I want to pause to see if anybody in the room has one. Otherwise, I'll keep going. No, keep going. Okay. So, how do you manage this thing that I think we all struggle with, which is about nuance? As scholars, we always want to this is true under these circumstances. Want to offer a lot of long, nuanced answers when that is not so much the news bite. How do you navigate that in your own preparation? Like, how do you get to the bullet point when you have a paragraph that you want to say?
I'll start out because I think you'll have direct experience you can talk to about that. But one thing we like to tell people is the best way to start that interview, because you know what your messages are that you want to convey, actually is just to provide that context up front. Like, do that first and get that out of the way and actually convey your messages right up front in the opening conversation. Or let me explain a little background and context for you, and then launch into what you would like them to know. So that's one way you can do it. I think the other thing is to think about, even if you're sort of leading with all of those ideas to begin with, you can come back to them throughout the interview. And that's another way to really just, emphasize the points that you want to make, but also by leading off with that, it sort of gives the reporter the opportunity to hear what you have to say and then ask follow-up questions about those things that you've already laid out for them.
The way I approach this in my own work, and I don't know if this is particular to my area or if this resonates across areas, but I think about it in terms of like levels of depth. And depending on the form of the interview, the time we've allotted, the person, if I know them or not, or I've worked with them or not before, and I sort of have an understanding of how deep their knowledge is, the audience, all those questions kind of tell me how deep do I want to go. And I love the idea of thinking about it, how would you explain this to a neighbor who doesn't know anything about what you do? That's kind of my starting point. And then if there are opportunities, we'll drill a bit deeper and a bit deeper and a bit deeper. But try to do that in a baby steps kind of way so that you're bringing the audience along with you. Because at the end of the day, you want to be the audience. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing your job. So start with something that resonates broadly with people that don't know anything. It's amazing how many people don't know anything about what you're talking about. It's astonishing. Because I don't know about you all, but when I think about my work, I think, well, of course everybody knows about the nits of constitutional law and public policy and stuff. Yeah, but they really don't. So just backing up and starting at that point, talking to your neighbor, and then drilling deeper and deeper, depending on the time and audience.
I think one of the strategies that I use a lot is to present the conventional way that people think about a particular issue or topic. And then I'll give like more nuances. So I think, people have a general kind of understanding. So I might say something, I'll just give an example. This is just speaking off the cuff, like, conventionally, like a lot of parents would think that enrolling their Black children into a predominantly white school might give them access to so-called better education and resources. And I was like, but what we know from research is that if we think about resources broadly and expansively in terms of identity, cultural affirmation, and so on and so forth, that paints a very different picture. And so what I would encourage your listeners or readers to think about is what are the kind of experiences they want your children to have. So a lot of times I'll try to come in at something that's like kind of conventional, so that it kind of like, yeah, that's how I think about it. That's what everybody says. And then I'll add, what we know from research, or what I found in my research is different than how people conventionally think about it. And so that's one strategy that I actually use a lot because it gives kind of the point. I don't know if it's a counterpoint, but a nuance point. Yeah.
And the other thing that you both mentioned, which we haven't talked at all about, is really audience. And this sort of goes back to preparation, but when you're asked to do that interview, the most important thing you can do is find out who the reporter is that's doing the interview, and then what the news organization is and what their audience is, because that plays a huge role in how you're going to talk about whatever the subject is. So that's another thing, I know I've mentioned this several times already, but we can do that research for you. Like, you don't have to do that yourself. So that's another way that we can support you, because you're going to be preparing and practicing for 30 minutes, but we can also look into that and give you some background on how many times this reporter's written about this particular, area or subject in their work, or is this something that they were just assigned today and they've never written about it before? And then audience for the, the media outlet is super important as well.
Can you give some more examples about audience variation and how that plays out?
Yeah, I mean, it could vary depending on, I loved your example earlier about the school board magazine, I think it was. That's a very targeted, focused audience that's going to be all people that have a significant knowledge about that particular area of expertise. And I think that it could be anything ranging from like a trade pub that specializes in, a very, let's just say a dentistry pub or something like that. It could be even sort of something that's related more to law versus something like the Tribune or something like a more general podcast or radio interview. So it really it's so broad that we could sort of narrow it for you though and say, even based on what we know about this news outlet, people that are the primary listeners are within this age range or from this area of the country, or their audience is particularly interested in political topics or whatever it might be. So we can actually get that background, and we do have resources available to us, not something that's, as easily to find perhaps, because we do use a source called Meltwater for our tracking and monitoring of all of the coverage, and it also gives us insights into the news outlets themselves, as well as all the things that the reporters have written about specifically. So it's a really nice way for us to be able to drill down and share that information with all of you. Sorry, did you have part 2 of the question?
No,
Okay.
no, not at all. One of the things when I was thinking about the conversation in advance and when I talked to people about their anxieties about doing this work, one of the things is about being misquoted, which we've already talked about. Another is about the particular moment we're in. And I would love to hear you all talk a little bit about, there's different kinds of pushback that one might receive. One could be from a colleague or someone in your field who's like, I totally disagree with you, and, so there's that. But then there's also all the trolls, the negative stuff. And for some folks, there can be, some pretty serious, I have a friend who does a lot of work on far right white nationalism, and they don't have the address of her center online, that kind of, so I'd love to hear you all talk a little about if you dealt with that, how you think about it, what the institution does about any of that.
You guys want to start?
Yeah.
I think, it's at the point now, I don't know if I get used to it.
Yeah.
But I kind of expect, right? But I know what I want to say, and I know that I believe in what I'm saying. I believe in the message that I'm conveying. But I think one of the times, it was the first time I remember I gave a keynote actually, and somebody in the conference audio recorded my keynote address and then deemed it to the conservative talk radio. And that's when I got on the radar.
Yeah.
Of, in certain states, if I actually have to tell people, if you invite me to come and speak, and it's you're using district dollars or whatever, you're probably going to get FOIA.
Yeah.
Because people, that's kind of how I'm tracked. I realize that and I know that.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is going back again to understanding the message that you want to convey. Because when I listened to the stuff that was leaked on the talk radio, I was like, I sound pretty good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's right. I didn't realize they said it like that,
Uh-huh.
So, I have a colleague who recently, we've been on our book tour for our book that was released in September, doing the work of equity leadership. And she was recently had somebody doxing her, So that kind of stuff happens depending on, what you're talking about. I'm mindful to try to not have information easily available, but people can find information that they want to find. If you decide to have a kind of public facing scholarly identity and you put your work out, people will find it, and unfortunately people will disagree with what you have to say. So I guess there's not anything that I necessarily do to try to fight. I think it again is that the question of being prepared and having preparation, and then also I'm selective about, the thing about it is that if it's in a school district or something like that, there's that audience is half the teachers are cheering and saying yeah, and then half of them are just this is what we're spending our tax dollars on. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So what do you do in that situation? But in other kind of media outlets, that's why I'm kind of choosy. I'm kind of picky. I don't want to be, I talked at the top of our conversation about I don't get into these punditry situations. I don't want to intentionally step into these kind of hostile situations because for me, life has hostilities without me stepping into it. So I think some of it is for me just kind of being selective, but also realizing that depending on what I'm focused on, that I get, mean-spirited, ignorant, hateful, racist, commentary and that sort of thing. And it happens, and I just don't read the comments. Just don't pay attention to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I did listen to the interview that these people did, though.
Did you?
Yeah, I listen to them sometimes.
Yeah.
The thing about it is that I grew up in South Carolina.
Uh-huh.
So the perspectives that
Yeah.
people have, they, you know, it's not like,
Surprising.
yeah, these are like the people who I went to high school with. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I'm listening to it and it's just like, oh, like I hear what they're saying. It's very different than how I think and believe. And they have a very different vision of how they want to see our society, how they want to see the world. But I have a vision that if they're putting their piece out, I want to actually put out what I want to. It's a vision that's different than theirs.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay. And I think that's part of being a scholar is being willing to wrestle at the level of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is when the people wrestle less with ideas and start to attack people and their families and that sort of thing. But I'm really listening a lot of times for how people are disagreeing with the ideas that I'm putting forward. And for me, that doesn't bother me because how I was trained in my graduate program is that you wrestle with ideas, right? You challenge other people's ideas. And so I just feel like it's part of what's expected if I'm gonna step out and, you know, have my scholarship more widely available.
In my area, I'm kind of lucky because media calls on me for kind of balanced analysis, right? And I've got my particular views, and I'm sure they come across, but I try to present them in a way that isn't, that I'm not proselytizing, I'm not making an argument. I really am trying to present a balanced approach, even if I'm communicating my own view. And I think that's more or less served me well. But I still routinely get really hateful emails from people on a regular basis after I do media. Mostly I don't read those, but sometimes they actually have good ideas, and so I'm willing to engage. I also have managed to get on a couple of conservative talk radio shows from time to time, conservative TV or Zoom kind of outlets, sort of talk interviews.
Yeah.
And what I appreciate about that is that it really challenges me and forces me to sort of rethink about how I'm presenting the material and the audience that I'm engaging in. They're not particularly pleasant conversations ever. I don't really enjoy that, but I do grow from it. So if you have an opportunity to kind of reach across the aisle and talk to people that you might not ordinarily agree with, sometimes it's not a bad thing.
Oh, yeah, go ahead and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for this.
Good question. I'm trying to think of I can't think of an example that would cover everything that would be like, yes, you can, or no, you can't. I think your example about the panel is interesting because I think that's a different situation, and particularly with that station, probably. This is not answering your question specifically, but I think it also is related somewhat. When, for example, I'll just say the university has an endorsement policy. And sometimes when people give interviews or are asked to give an interview, we need to make sure that it's not in conflict with the endorsement policy, which I think is kind of related to this in some ways, because the example I can think of off the top of my head is, let's just say you're using a particular software in your classroom or something, and that company wants you to, do an interview about how great that is for your students. That might be something that we would say, you need to be very careful about how you're describing that and how you're using it, and be very factual about it without providing an endorsement of that software just because we're a public university. I think the call to action, it's not, like I said, exactly the same, but I think it depends what the call to action is and how you could frame it in a way that is perhaps factual and not leading or particularly, supportive of one viewpoint or another. But I guess it would depend what it is. We'd have to sort of talk through what that specific example is for a call to action. I'm sorry, I don't have a straightforward answer for you, but I just wanted to throw out those other things to think about as you're doing that. And those are the kinds of things that, just talking through it can help to frame how you're going to position it.
I would also say a lot of the media stuff that some people do is all about policy recommendations, which are like a call to action, but not so much, they're not like directed, like you do this, they're like, this is what I think needs to happen, that kind of thing. And I think that is another thing that's like really helpful to prepare in advance, because there is going to be that question almost at the end, like, what do you think should happen, Although the way you answered it, it sounded like one of those tricky ethics, annual ethics exam. Yeah. Do you want to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have called to action. A lot of my scholarship is around how people can improve schools and improve people's learning experiences and outcomes. So people often are just like, I think about that as a core part of my scholarship, is saying, here's what people can do, whether you're a superintendent, whether you're a board member, whether you're a parent, whether you're a student. So I think about all those kind of things, and they're typically very, broad. So if I'm on a podcast with parenting, I say, like, here's 3 ways you can get involved. And I encourage you all, if you listen to this conversation and you're interested about what you can do, here's 3 ways you can get involved, right? And some of them are pretty specific. If I'm talking to Chicago, I say, run for your LSC, right? Everybody has an LSC for their local school. You can run for your LSC. We have an elected school board. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but you should vote, right? So just those kind of things are a very common thing that I do when I'm, and then a lot of folks ask, they'll actually ask, if they're interviewing you, like, well, we've had this conversation. What are 3 things that you think our listeners need to know, or what can they do if they want to address this issue? And so having those kind of like actionable calls to action are a basic part of what I do pretty much for most of any kind of media engagement I do.
Thank you for those. Those are spot on, yeah.
Want to go to the
There's a few questions in the chat. First, from Edward Burry, have any of the speakers had to participate in a conversation with a non-traditional journalist, such as an influencer? If so, what additional preparations were taken?
Can you read the other one too? And then
Yes, so there's 2 more. From Eleanor Cole, I'm curious if any of the speakers have been media trained or did they just learn from experience? And then Anna Jankova said, what are some good screening questions for finding a good PR team?
Influencers, have you talked to influencers? Go ahead, you want to start? Either, you can pick whichever one you want.
This will sound really silly, but
Yeah.
I guess I'm not sure exactly how we define influencer. I mean, the range of media today seems to be more of a spectrum as opposed to categories. And I haven't engaged with somebody that, my kids, for example, would call an influencer. But certainly
You're not on TikTok.
I'm not on TikTok. But actually, I did have one experience on Instagram. We did an Instagram live with, I guess he was an influencer. We had a full hour, and I gotta say it was long. We just had a really, really good time. And I didn't know what to expect because it's not a platform that I used. I just kind of winged it and prepared as if I were doing an hour-long interview at WTTW or something, and it worked. The audience was super engaged, super excited for it, and we just had a really, really good time. So I guess I did have an experience.
But you prepared the same way, it sounds like.
I prepared the same way, and I guess what I would say is just expect a much more sort of free-flowing kind of environment than what you would if you had a microphone at VAC or you had a desk at WTTW or whatever. Much more interactive, much more engaging.
And perhaps more aligned with shows, radio shows that have callers that call in, for example. I mean, those are a completely different experience than just a one-on-one with a reporter. So thinking about it in that way might be helpful.
I think that's helpful too.
Yeah,
And those are fun too, right? Call shows.
they can be, or not.
Yeah. The people who still call them the radio shows have deep questions.
Yes.
That's what I learned. I'm like, oh, if they call into the radio station, I'm like, okay, like, I would say one of the things about IG Live, which is a good thing to use, is that it's only on the phone. The first time I had an IG Live, I was like on the computer.
Oh.
I was like, I don't know how to get on. You know what I mean? It was like, you can only get on IG Live from your phone, from the app. So just learning something, that's again preparation stuff that I had no idea about. I thought I could log on my computer, I had my background ready, and it was like, no, you have to actually talk on your phone. Oh my goodness. Anyway, so that's preparation stuff, knowing the platforms. I have done media training, and occasionally we'll do refreshers, especially if I have a new book coming out. I did one for my first book, and then the new book had a new round. That new book was me and my colleague. It was a new experience to share platforms and to co-write. So for our previous book, my colleague Annie Shimaru, we co-edited this book, and so a lot of stuff that we wrote for Education Week and different periodicals, we co-wrote together, and a lot of the podcasts and stuff we were on together. So we did a kind of round of media training to help us understand which talking points each one of us is going to take.
Yeah.
Right. So we had to do that, and then we have like these kind of like small facial expressions that we make when we're on camera to tell one person to take the question and that sort of thing if they don't call on us. So yeah, I would say that like even if you get media training is we don't get it in academia, and so even if you just do like a workshop, it's a lot of really good information. I will say this though, it's probably for the first 6 to 9 months I was like, this is a waste of time and money. Because it's a totally different way of thinking, and a totally different approach of how you share ideas, how you share your scholarship. And I just was like, I don't know how this is working. You know what I mean? So it does take time. So you might have a workshop setting, but I would encourage everybody to take some kind of media training and that sort of thing. And then the final thing was about screening questions for PR people. That's kind of a long one. I would say, what I liked about the Coriolis company, my PR coach is named Nanda Dasu. They're based out of LA, and what I appreciated most is their emphasis on making sure they were elevating my voice, which is something that I struggle with because I'm not the most outspoken person. Typically, if I'm in a room, I'll come, I'll listen to what people have to say, and I will leave, and I will talk about it with my wife. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so having them really kind of like say, your voice is important, you have a contribution to make, and have that person is always in my ear saying, some of the stuff would be like, this person's on this, that should be you up there. Those are the big kind of intangible kind of things that really benefited me, because if I didn't have someone really telling me that, I probably would not think of myself as someone who could make contributions to a broader kind of like public conversation. So I would say that finding somebody who believes in your work and they can champion your work even when you don't think it needs to be championed is the most important thing that I've got out of working with folks.
So I didn't have any formal media training, but whenever I do media, I intentionally spend time with producer, the interviewer, anybody else involved in the production, and just ask as many questions as we can about what they do, how they present themselves, what they think is interesting, how can I do a better job, and just pump them for as much information as I can. And so through trial and error and learning by those conversations, and then also at the same time developing media relationships for future spots.
Took me a long time to understand what producers did, like, that they're, how much of the work they're doing.
Most of it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, okay. So,
Unrelated to the question, but I did want to mention something else that we haven't had a chance to talk about, but it's another selfish plug. So I know that sometimes you want to dip your toe into doing media, but maybe you're not comfortable putting yourself out there for a particular interview. We do have something here at UIC. We're a partner in The Conversation. And if you're not familiar with The Conversation, it's basically explanatory journalism. And faculty can write for The Conversation on a topic of your choice. It's a really good way to learn how to pitch an editor on a story that you're interested in, your research, for example, a particular topic that's in the news. They're constantly looking for experts as well to put into stories that they're writing. The interesting thing about submitting a piece to The Conversation is that you are in control of writing it. You work directly with an editor at The Conversation, and it really helps you, I would say, fine-tune your skills for understanding what journalists are interested in writing about and working with an editor in a way that gives you control over the publication, which you often don't have if you're participating in an outside interview. So if anybody is interested in that, we do have a page on today.uic.edu that explains The Conversation. We have somebody on my team that you can work with directly to pitch the editors at The Conversation. And it's just an opportunity, to sort of get your feet wet if you're interested in doing something like that. The last thing I also wanted to mention is that we also have a page on our website that provides guidance for doing interviews for faculty and staff on campus. So I can send that link out afterwards if you want to include it.
that would be awesome.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been incredibly helpful, and I have taken a million notes, as has everybody else. And as I said, we will continue to have these conversations. So if you have other ideas of conversations like this that you'd like to have, please let us know. Otherwise, you have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah.